If that woman in seat 32A says the plane is going down, listen to her. Nobody heard the old man whisper it over the sound of rolling carry-ons, crying babies, and the usual noise of Flight 271 from Denver to Norfolk. Evelyn Hart sat near the back beside the window, hands folded over a worn gray coat. She looked like the kind of passenger people forgot 5 minutes after boarding. Mid-30s. Brown hair tied low. Pale skin. Quiet eyes. A flight attendant had already asked her twice to stop looking out at the left wing. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated now." Evelyn nodded politely, but her eyes stayed on the engine. Something in the vibration was wrong. The man beside her, a salesman from Omaha, laughed softly when she leaned closer to the window. "You one of those nervous flyers?" She gave a small smile. "No, nothing else." 10 minutes later, the plane hit rough air over the Rockies. The cabin lights flickered once. A few people gasped. Someone near the front started praying under his breath. Evelyn looked up immediately. Not at the ceiling. Not at the passengers. At the sound. There was a low shudder beneath the floor. Too rhythmic. Too sharp. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Counted. 1, 2, 3. Then again. Her fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. The left engine was surging every 3 seconds. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle telling everyone to remain calm. Her smile looked practiced. Her hands did not. Evelyn pressed the call button. When the attendant reached her row, she lowered her voice. "You need to tell the captain the left engine is running uneven. There may be fuel flow damage." The young attendant blinked, then gave the same smile. "Thank you, ma'am. The pilots are aware of the turbulence." "This isn't turbulence." The attendant walked away anyway. Across the aisle, a teenage boy rolled his eyes. "My mom does this every flight too." A few people chuckled. Evelyn looked back out the window. The sky outside had turned dark blue, almost black. Far below, the mountains looked like shadows under the moon. Then she saw it. A brief orange flash inside the left engine housing. Barely half a second. Most people would have missed it. Evelyn stood up so quickly the man beside her nearly spilled his drink. "Sit down," someone shouted from the front. Another jolt hit the aircraft. Harder this time. The overhead bins rattled. A woman screamed. Then the left side of the plane dropped nearly 20 feet. Oxygen masks burst from the ceiling. Lights flashed red. Somewhere near the cockpit, an alarm began to scream. Evelyn never screamed. She reached up, pulled on her oxygen mask, then turned to the terrified little girl across the aisle whose hands were shaking too badly to put hers on. "Look at me," Evelyn said softly. "You're okay." Her hands moved fast, calm, precise. Around them the cabin was falling apart into noise. Evelyn Hart looked toward the front of the plane with the same expression she had worn since takeoff. Like she had seen this before. The little girl clung to Evelyn's sleeve as the plane shook again. A flight attendant stumbled into the aisle, catching herself against the seats. Her face had gone completely white. "Everyone stay seated," she shouted, though her voice cracked halfway through. Nobody listened. People were crying now. Some were trying to call their families. Others just stared at the oxygen masks hanging in front of them like they could not understand what they meant. Evelyn handed the girl back to her mother, then moved forward through the aisle. Not fast, not panicked, deliberate. Every step seemed measured against the motion of the plane. A man grabbed her arm as she passed. "Where are you going?" She looked at him for half a second. "To stop this from getting worse." The words were quiet. Somehow that made them more believable. Near row 14, one of the flight attendants was kneeling beside an older passenger struggling to breathe. Her hands shook so badly, she dropped the emergency oxygen bottle. Evelyn crouched beside her. "Open the valve 2 turns." "Not all the way." The attendant stared at her. "How do you know that?" Evelyn was already adjusting the mask over the man's face. "Because if you open it fully, you lose pressure too fast." The attendant obeyed without another word. Another violent jolt hit the plane. The lights went out for 1 long second. When they came back, half the cabin was lit in red emergency lighting. The left side of the aircraft gave a deep metallic groan that seemed to come from somewhere beneath their feet. Evelyn looked up toward the cockpit. Her expression changed. Just slightly. Enough to know something else had failed. She kept moving. By the time she reached the front galley, 2 flight attendants were arguing in frightened whispers. One of them blocked her path immediately. "You cannot be up here. Your captain has less than 3 minutes before the fuel imbalance spreads." The woman blinked. "How would you even know that?" Evelyn looked past her toward the cockpit door. Because the vibration stopped. For a second nobody spoke. The younger attendant frowned. Stopped is good, right? Not on one side. Silence. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Daniel Brooks stepped out, one hand braced against the wall. Tall. Early 40s. Sharp jaw, silver at his temples. He looked irritated more than afraid. What is going on out here? The older attendant pointed at Evelyn. She keeps insisting she knows what is wrong with the plane. Daniel looked her up and down. Gray sweater. Worn coat. Nothing special. Ma'am, please return to your seat. Evelyn met his eyes. You lost the left engine bleed air system 30 seconds ago. The fuel pump is beginning to fail. If you keep turning south, you will not make it over the mountains. The captain stared at her. Behind him, another warning alarm sounded inside the cockpit. A sharp repeating tone. His expression changed for the first time. How do you know that? Because I have heard that sound before. The plane dropped again. Harder this time. Someone screamed in the back. Daniel grabbed the doorway to steady himself. Evelyn did not move. There is an Air Force field 87 miles east, she said. You need to turn now. That base is restricted. Not tonight. He kept staring at her, caught between disbelief and something else. Then from somewhere under her sleeve, as she reached for the wall, the edge of an old silver bracelet slipped into view. Tiny letters worn nearly smooth by time. Daniel only caught 2 words before she pulled her sleeve down again. Ghost 7. Daniel Brooks looked at the silver bracelet for only a second, but something in his face tightened. Where did you get that? Another warning alarm cut through the cockpit before Evelyn could answer. One of the flight attendants nearly lost her balance as the plane shuddered again. The nose dipped. Loose bags slid down the aisle. Somewhere in the back, a child began crying hysterically. Evelyn turned toward the cockpit. Captain, if you want these people alive, stop asking questions. He should have argued. Every rule said he should. Instead, he stepped aside. The cockpit was darker than the cabin. Half the instrument panel still glowed. The other half blinked with red warnings. The co-pilot sat rigid in his seat, one hand gripping the controls too tightly. Fuel pressure left side is dropping fast, he said. We are losing electrical systems one at a time. Evelyn moved closer without hesitation. Her eyes swept across the panel once. Quick. Precise. Not the way a frightened passenger would look. More like someone returning to a room she had not seen in years. Daniel watched her carefully now. You have flown before. No, she said quietly. I just used to keep planes from falling out of the sky. The co-pilot looked over at her. What does that even mean? Evelyn did not answer. She reached beneath the radio console, fingers moving without hesitation until she found a small covered switch hidden behind a metal panel. Daniel stared at her. How did you know that was there? Military emergency backup frequency. She flipped the cover open. Dust had gathered around the edges. It looked like it had not been touched in years. Nobody uses this anymore, Daniel said. Someone still does. Another alarm sounded. Outside the windshield, lightning flashed across the clouds. For 1 second the cockpit filled with white light. Evelyn looked through it, as if she were seeing something else entirely. A different storm. A different cockpit. Men shouting through static. A voice saying her call sign over and over again until the radio went silent. Her hand froze for the smallest moment. Then she reached for the microphone. Daniel caught her wrist. Wait. Who are you? She looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes. No fear. Just something old. Something tired. You do not need my name, she said softly. You need the runway. The plane dropped another 100 feet. The co-pilot swore under his breath. Captain, we are running out of time. Daniel let go of her wrist. Evelyn pressed the button on the radio. Nothing happened at first except static. Thick. Empty. Endless. Then she spoke, each word calm and perfectly clear. Military emergency channel. This is civilian aircraft flight 271. Requesting immediate corridor clearance. Ghost Raven 7 is on board. Silence. 5 seconds. Maybe 6. Daniel could hear his own breathing. Then the static cracked sharply. A voice came through the speakers. Male. Controlled. Disbelieving. Say again the call sign. Evelyn never looked away from the dark sky ahead. Ghost Raven 7. More silence. This time shorter. Then another voice broke in. Younger. Shaken. My God. Daniel looked out the windshield just as 2 distant lights appeared through the storm. Fast. Closing. Closing impossibly fast. The radio came alive again. Ghost Raven 7, this is Viper Lead. We thought you were dead. The cockpit went completely still. Even the alarm seemed farther away for one strange second. Daniel stared through the windshield as the two lights cut through the clouds. They were not lights anymore. They were F-22s, one on each side of the aircraft, close enough to see the gray shape of the wings in the lightning. The co-pilot whispered the words like he could not believe them. Why would fighters escort us? Evelyn did not answer. Her eyes stayed forward. The radio crackled again. Ghost Raven 7, this is Viper Lead. Maintain heading 083. You are cleared direct to Raven Rock Air Base. We have you. Daniel grabbed the controls. Raven Rock? That base does not exist on civilian charts. It exists, Evelyn said quietly. Keep the nose level. Another burst of turbulence slammed through the plane. The left engine gave a deep, grinding sound. Then silence. Complete silence from the left side. The co-pilot looked down at the panel. We just lost the engine. A warning horn filled the cockpit. Red lights flashed across the controls. Behind them, the cabin erupted into terrified screams. Daniel's hands tightened. We are too heavy. We are not going to make it. Evelyn stepped beside him. You are going to make it. You do not know that. She looked at the instruments once. Flaps 15 degrees. Hold 180 knots. Do not fight the drift. Let the right engine carry you. Daniel looked at her. How do you know all this? The answer took too long. Long enough that he almost thought she would not give one. Then she said, very softly, because I used to talk pilots home. Outside the windshield, the lead F-22 dipped one wing. Then the pilot's voice returned. Different now. Less military. More personal. Ma'am, if this is really you. Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second. Stay focused, Lieutenant. Silence on the radio. Then a quiet answer. Yes, ma'am. Daniel turned toward her sharply. Lieutenant. Ma'am. Nobody spoke to a random passenger like that. The co-pilot was staring at her bracelet again, where it had slipped below her sleeve. Ghost 7. He swallowed hard. I have heard that before. Evelyn said nothing. The younger man leaned closer, searching his memory. My brother was Air Force. Afghanistan. He used to talk about a woman on the radio. Nobody knew her name. Just the call sign. He said if Ghost 7 answered, everybody came home. The cockpit fell silent again. Evelyn looked out at the darkness beyond the glass. For the first time, something changed in her face. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Pain. Old pain. Deep enough to live there for years. Lightning flashed across the sky. In that white light, Daniel saw tears in her eyes. Only for a second. Then they were gone. The radio crackled once more. Ghost Raven 7. Viper Lead said quietly. Colonel Mercer is waiting on the runway. Evelyn's hand tightened around the edge of the console. Ryan. Yes, ma'am. She looked down at the floor. Very slowly. Like she had not heard that name spoken out loud in a long time. Then she lifted her eyes back to the windshield. Far ahead, through the storm, a single runway light appeared in the darkness. The runway light grew brighter through the storm. One line of white cutting through the darkness. Daniel leaned forward in his seat, staring at it like he was not sure it was real. I still do not understand, he said quietly. Who are you? Evelyn kept her eyes on the windshield. Somebody who should have stayed forgotten. The words hung in the cockpit. The co-pilot looked away. Even he knew not to ask again. Outside, the two F-22s stayed beside them, one on each wing. Silent now. Watching. The aircraft shook violently as another crosswind hit. Daniel fought the controls. We are too high. No, Evelyn said calmly. You are afraid. He looked at her sharply. She pointed ahead. Drop 500 feet. Keep your speed. Trust the runway. Something in her voice cut through the panic. Daniel lowered the nose slightly. The plane began to descend. Below them, more lights appeared. Not city lights. Vehicles. Emergency crews lining the runway. Military trucks. Flashing beacons. At the far end of the airfield, a black SUV waited beside the tarmac. The radio crackled one last time. Ghost 7. Wind is 12 knots from the west. Runway is yours. Daniel froze at the words. Not Ghost Raven 7. Just Ghost 7. Familiar. Personal. Like whoever was speaking had said it 100 times before. Evelyn reached toward the radio slowly. Copy that. Her voice almost broke on the last word. Then she let go of the microphone. The plane dropped beneath the clouds. The runway rushed toward them. Too fast. Too narrow. The The right engine roared. The dead left side dragged against the air. Every alarm in the cockpit screamed at once. "Pull up," the co-pilot shouted. "We are too low." "No," Evelyn said. "Now." Daniel pulled back gently. The wheels hit the runway so hard the entire plane shook. A few oxygen masks dropped loose from the ceiling. Somebody in the cabin screamed. Then came the longest 5 seconds of Daniel Brooks's life. The aircraft raced down the runway on one engine, pulling hard to the left. Daniel fought the controls with both hands. Rain hammered the windshield. The brakes screamed. Then slowly, impossibly, the plane came to a stop. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was heavy breathing. Daniel sat frozen, with both hands still on the controls. The co-pilot stared straight ahead. Then from the cabin behind them came something unexpected. Applause. One person at first. Then another. Then the whole plane. Shaky. Emotional. Relieved. Daniel turned toward Evelyn. She was already standing. "Where are you going?" he asked. She pulled her gray coat tighter around her shoulders. "Home, I think." Before he could answer, the cockpit door opened. A young flight attendant stood there with tears in her eyes. "There are soldiers outside asking for you." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. Then she stepped into the aisle. Every passenger turned to look at her. The little girl from row 18 still held the oxygen mask in her lap. "Are you a pilot?" she whispered. Evelyn smiled faintly. "No." The cabin door opened. Cold rain blew inside. At the bottom of the stairs, beneath the flashing runway lights, a tall man in an Air Force coat stood waiting. White hair at his temples. Rigid posture. Eyes fixed only on her. The moment Evelyn stepped onto the wet tarmac, Colonel Ryan Mercer raised his hand in a perfect salute. Rain ran down Evelyn Hart's face as she stepped off the aircraft. The runway lights reflected in the water around her boots. Nobody moved behind her. Passengers stood frozen in the doorway. Flight attendants. Pilots. Ground crews. Every eye stayed on the man waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Colonel Ryan Mercer did not lower his salute. Not even in the rain. Not even when the wind nearly tore his coat open. Evelyn stopped 3 steps away from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel Brooks had followed her onto the tarmac. He stood a few feet behind, soaked by the rain, still trying to understand what he was seeing. Colonels did not salute civilians, especially not civilians in gray sweaters and worn bracelets. Ryan finally lowered his hand. His voice was quiet. "We buried an empty coffin for you." Evelyn looked away toward the dark shape of the mountains beyond the base. "You should not have. We had no body, no radio, nothing after Kandahar." The name seemed to change the air between them. Daniel saw it. Immediately, Evelyn's shoulders stiffened. Her fingers tightened around the sleeve hiding the silver bracelet. One of the F-22s screamed overhead before disappearing into the clouds. Ryan looked at her carefully. "You heard them tonight. They still remember your call sign. That does not mean they should." Her answer came fast. Too fast. Ryan took one slow step closer. "You talked 12 aircraft home through a sandstorm with no tower, no radar, no runway lights. You stayed on the radio for 6 hours after your own aircraft went down." Daniel stared at Evelyn. The quiet woman from seat 32A said nothing. Ryan kept speaking, not to impress anyone, not for drama. He sounded like a man finally saying something he had carried for years. "Half the Air Force thought Ghost 7 was a myth. The other half thought you were dead." Evelyn looked down at the wet concrete. "Most of the people from that night are dead. Not because of you. You do not know that." For the first time, her voice cracked. Just slightly. Ryan went silent. The wind moved across the runway. Somewhere behind them, emergency crews were helping passengers off the plane. Nobody was leaving. They all kept watching her. The little girl from row 18 stood near the door holding her mother's hand. "Mom," she whispered, loud enough for Daniel to hear. "Why are the soldiers looking at her like that?" Her mother did not answer. She did not know how. Ryan reached into his coat pocket. Slowly, carefully, he pulled out a small metal object wrapped in a handkerchief. Evelyn froze the second she saw it. A pair of old military dog tags. Worn silver, bent at one corner. Ryan held them out in his hand. They found these in the wreckage. Evelyn stared at them without touching them. Rain slid from her hair onto her cheeks. Daniel could not tell where the rain ended. "I kept them," Ryan said softly, "in case you ever came home." Her hand shook as she reached for the tags. On the metal, barely visible beneath the scratches, Daniel saw the words stamped into the silver. "Captain Evelyn Hart." Call sign, Ghost 7. The runway disappeared into silence. Then, very slowly, Captain Daniel Brooks straightened his back and raised his hand in salute. Captain Daniel Brooks held the salute until his arm began to shake. Nobody told him to do it. Nobody expected him to. He simply could not stand there any longer pretending Evelyn Hart was just another passenger. Slowly, one of the younger ground crew beside the runway copied him. Then another. Within seconds, every soldier near the aircraft stood at attention in the rain. Evelyn looked at them in silence. She had spent years avoiding this moment. Years moving from town to town, changing jobs, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions. A diner in Wyoming. A bookstore in Missouri. 6 months teaching math in a small town outside Richmond. Every time someone asked where she was from, she gave the same answer. Nowhere important. Ryan Mercer stepped beside her, lowering his voice. You disappeared after Kandahar. I tried. Why? Evelyn looked down at the old dog tags in her hand. Because everybody else stayed there. The rain softened. The runway lights blurred in the wet darkness. For a moment, she was not standing at Raven Rock anymore. She was back in another cockpit. Another storm. Sand instead of rain. A transport plane limping through the sky over Kandahar with half its instruments dead. Young pilots calling over the radio. Voices full of fear they tried to hide. She had been sitting in a dark operations trailer with a headset pressed against one ear, guiding them home one by one through a dust storm so thick nobody could see more than 50 feet. One aircraft lost contact. Then another. She stayed on the radio anyway. For 6 straight hours. Calm. Precise. Never raising her voice. The younger pilots started calling her Ghost 7 because they never saw her face. Only heard the voice that brought them home. Ryan looked toward the runway. Do you know how many people are alive because of that night? Evelyn shook her head. No, 312. She closed her eyes. Then why does it still feel like I lost? Ryan did not answer right away. He understood the question too well. Finally, he looked at her and said, because the good ones always count the people they could not save. Daniel stood a few feet away, listening. He thought about the woman he had dismissed in the front galley. The woman he had almost ordered back to her seat. Beside the aircraft, the little girl from row 18 slipped away from her mother and walked slowly across the wet tarmac. She stopped in front of Evelyn, holding something small in both hands. A paper airline wing pin, the kind they gave children before takeoff. You can have mine, she said softly, because you are the bravest person on the plane. Evelyn looked down at the tiny plastic wings. For the first time all night, she smiled. Small. Real. She knelt in front of the little girl. No, she said gently. Keep them. You stayed brave too. Then she reached up and clipped the old silver bracelet around her wrist again, covering the words that had changed everything. Ghost 7. The storm finally began to move east. Rain still fell across the runway, but softer now. The passengers from Flight 271 stood beneath the wing of the aircraft wrapped in blankets, watching soldiers move around Evelyn as if she belonged to another world. Maybe she did. A black SUV rolled slowly across the tarmac and stopped beside the runway lights. 2 officers stepped out. One carried a folder. The other stopped the moment he saw Evelyn. He was older. Air Force blue coat. Silver hair. His expression changed in an instant. Captain Hart, he said quietly. Sir, she answered. Daniel looked between them. You know her too? The man gave a short laugh with no humor in it. Know her? 20 years ago she saved my son. Evelyn looked away immediately. I gave him headings. That was all. No, the officer shook his head. My son was flying through a storm over Iraq. He was 19. He was lost, terrified, almost out of fuel. Then a voice came over the radio. Calm. Clear. She stayed with him until he landed. The old man's eyes were wet now. He still keeps the recording. Nobody spoke. The passengers who had mocked Evelyn on the plane stood completely silent. The salesman from Omaha stared at the ground. The flight attendant who had ignored her wiped tears from her face. Ryan opened the folder slowly. Inside was a faded photograph. 12 men and women in flight. Suits standing in front of an aircraft. Young. Smiling. Evelyn froze the second she saw it. Ryan held it carefully so the rain would not touch it. We found this in storage last year. Her eyes moved across every face in the picture, then stopped on one. A young woman standing in the back with a silver bracelet around her wrist. You kept this? She whispered. I kept everything. Ryan looked down at the photograph. Ghost 7 was never supposed to be one person. It was a team. You were the last one left. Evelyn took the picture with both hands. For a long moment she said nothing. Then very softly she said, "There were 12 of us." Daniel glanced at the old photograph again. What happened to them? The wind moved across the runway. Far above, one of the F-22s circled once before disappearing into the clouds. Evelyn looked after it. They stayed on the radio so others could get home. Her voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the rain. One by one, they went silent. Nobody asked anything after that. They did not need to. The little girl from row 18 stepped closer again, still holding her paper wings. "Were you scared?" she asked. Evelyn looked down at her, then out toward the dark sky beyond the runway. "Every second," she said. "Being brave does not mean you are not afraid. It means you keep talking even when your voice shakes." The little girl nodded slowly. Around them, every soldier, every passenger, every crew member stood in silence. Not because they had to, because for the first time, they finally understood the quiet woman from seat 32A. The black SUV stayed idling beside the runway. Ryan Mercer opened the rear door, but Evelyn did not move. She stood beneath the fading rain with the old photograph in one hand, the dog tags in the other. Around her, the noise of the airfield slowly returned. Mechanics moved toward the damaged aircraft. Medical crews checked the passengers. The storm was ending. Daniel Brooks stepped closer. "Captain Hart." She looked at him. He still stood straighter than before, as if he could not help it now. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn gave the smallest shake of her head. "You did your job." "No," he said quietly. "I judged you before I knew who you were." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel reached into his pocket and held out something small. The paper boarding pass from seat 32A. He had written one word across the top in black ink. "Respect." Evelyn looked at it, then at him. A faint smile touched her face. "Take care of your passengers, Captain." "I will." The little girl from row 8